Hey everybody, welcome. We're sitting down here to have a chat about the TPP. As everyone's probably heard, Trump just signed an executive order the other day withdrawing the United States, which was a major player in that agreement. So he signed an executive order withdrawing them from the agreement, which most people think effectively ends the agreement. So we just wanted to have a chat about it, see if we can break down what it is and if that's a good thing or a bad thing for the United States and for the rest of the signatories. With me today, I have His Royal Highness the Sultan Baland Rabayah, who is an economics analyst with Being Libertarian.com. And also with me is Nima Major, who is he runs the Economics Junkie website and podcast, and also is an economics analyst for Being Libertarian.
Deputy Sultan.
Deputy Sultan. There we go. I was going to say Crusader King, but maybe not.
Okay, I'll take that. All right. Done.
Why don't we start with you, Baland? Let me know what your thoughts are on everything that's going on there.
Okay, so basically, well, as we know, we don't know much about the TPP. Even actual economists which have studied the TPP don't know much about the TPP in the first place, which is a funny thing because it's a bit complex and it's not very straightforward as a document. It's 550 pages long, and within those
5,500.
Oh, sorry, 5,500. There we go, 50, not 550, 5,500. My bad, 5,500 pages long. Nima already has a correction.
I'll start counting scores. Nima 1.
Baland 0. But basically, with the TPP, within those 5,500 or 5,500 pages, there we go. Let me just speak simple English. There's thousands and thousands of regulations which would be added within each countries per se, or with the countries within those signatories. And in fact, if you want to break down some of the chapters within the TPP on what regulations are focused on, I have a list over here of some of the regulations. There's regulations on competition, cooperations, capacity buildings, cross-border services, customs, e-commerce, environment, financial services, government, procurement, intellectual property, investments, labor, legal issues, market access for goods, rules of origins, whatever that means, sanitary standards, technical barriers to trade, telecommunication. That's not the end of the list. Let me just flip the page. It's almost done. Temporary entry, textile and apparels, textile, let's just call it textiles, and trade remedies. That's actually 22 of the very many things that are regulated within this document. 22 of a lot. I don't think it's countable if you actually go through the pages. I mean, it is, but that'll take a long time. So as we can see there already, this isn't really a free trade agreement altogether. It has regulations on basically these 22 items, and that's not all the items on the list. I just found these 22 items off the Mises website itself and what's being regulated. So essentially, if it was really a free trade agreement, what we would see is that we wouldn't have any chapters or 5,500 pages regarding on how free trade would work. It would just be simple and plain English right over there, maybe just 100, 200 pages at max on what's going to be taken into consideration and how it's going to be done in a way of free trade. But clearly, from what we can see, it's 5,500 pages, adds thousands and thousands of regulations, and those are just 22 areas which are being affected out of many different areas in the first place. And I have a quote from Ludwig von Mises. Each country has a system of varying privileges for individual groups, and none of these measures would work if foreign countries were to freely supply the domestic market, which, if we expand on that, essentially, all the interest groups within each of these 12 signatory countries have very special ties with one another, and most probably this trade agreement came into existence just to solidify such a monopoly. And as we can see in some of these areas, most probably there's some influences, some political influences on why these regulations are coming into place in the first place. But that's all I
list
have.
the countries?
So the countries that are involved, some of the major ones at least. Sorry, give me 1 second. My computer's having issues here. Some of the major countries that are involved are Canada, the United States, Australia. Actually, I can pull it up here. Give me one moment.
I have it here if you want. I can read it out.
Sure, yeah.
So US, Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam.
Wow.
That seems so random, doesn't it?
See, what I'd understood at the very beginning, at the outset of when they were talking about the TPP, was that it was an idea designed to keep trade and boost trade within America's allies, cutting out China, cutting out, people who were threatening America's economic hegemony.
Okay.
So apparently that changed over time. Someone was tweeting me the other day saying that China was added to the list later on, and I'm not sure all the details. But that part there, I kind of understood from a geopolitical standpoint, where you want to boost the ease of trade within your friends and restrict trade with your enemies, kind of hopefully hurting them in that way. But apparently it's much more than that. That must have been just a small snippet or a small opinion on
That's
what
the
it
story,
could be.
right?
Right, exactly. Whether that's factual or not is a whole other story. Well, Nima, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the?
So I'm just going to read something from Breitbart here. This is, I think, from 2015. Jeff Sessions held a speech in Congress, and he actually stacked up the entire bill next to him. And as we mentioned, actually the exact number is 5,554 pages.
Wow.
And he pointed at it. And one quote that I thought was interesting: "We are empowering the TPP countries to create really a new Congress of sorts, a group with delegates that goes and meets and decides important issues that can impact everyday life of Americans. So the American representative in this commission, which will operate in many ways like the UN, will not be answerable to voters anywhere." And so Baland brought up the different fields of regulation, and I just want to read from an article. I posted a link here, New Economic Perspectives, where he cites an anecdote over what happened with a similar agreement between the Netherlands and the Czech Republic. Because one of the main points of contention, I think, in the TPP has been the so-called investor-state courts, where investors can sue governments. And here's an example of, I would say, pretty undesirable consequences of such a investor-state court. Under the under the Kingdom of the Netherlands Czech Republic trade agreement, the Czech Republic was sued in an investor-state proceeding for failing to bail out an insolvent bank, which an investor company had an interest in. The investor company was awarded $236 million in the dispute settlement. So under the TPP or the TTIP, what would prevent a similar action against the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States if it failed to bail out banks that were too big to fail in the future? And what could be the damages if the Fed decided to let Bank of America fail, the FDIC took it into resolution, and then a Saudi-based investment company decided to try to collect from the Federal Reserve? So I thought that was pretty interesting. You sue a government for failing to bail out a bank, and you get awarded a settlement for that?
That's incredible.
Wow.
So much for encouraging risk
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
country.
Yeah, no kidding. And not to mention just the incredible lack of sovereignty at that point, when you can sue an entire country for for their individual choices as a country. I mean, you can be going against the wishes of the people and be awarded the settlement and actually win.
Especially the example of failing to bail out a bank. That's
ridiculous.
Offensive, egregious example of incursion.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I know there was a conversation around the lawsuit from Philip Morris against Uruguay as well. Let me just open this up here really quickly. Yeah, they were saying one of the biggest concerns, like you said, was the investor-state dispute settlement courts, and they were saying the practice was made widely known through the Philip Morris versus Uruguay case, where a tobacco company, Philip Morris, sued Uruguay after they've enacted strict laws aimed at promoting public health. So obviously, I mean, in some cases, for example, here in Canada, they have very graphic images on each cigarette package to discourage smoking. And they have a lot of laws and a lot of...
in Europe as well.
Is that right? Yeah, it's the whole idea is you want... I mean, they tax cigarettes like there's no tomorrow as well. The idea being don't smoke. And if you are going to smoke, you're going to pay through the nose for it.
You want your money, but don't smoke.
But don't smoke. But give us money. But just the fact that a company would sue a country for protecting its or for trying to protect its citizens, and you can argue the right or wrongness of putting those kinds of disclaimers in place or trying to discourage certain activities. That being said, I would say the moral high ground lies with the country protecting its citizens over the tobacco company.
I mean, yeah, even if I disagree with laws coercing businesses to do such things, it's ultimately up to the people in the country to decide. I think it's very... this particular case may not be as egregious, but there's so many unintended consequences that I can see ensuing from this that we don't even know. So that's really ultimately what it comes down to, I think.
Essentially, what can happen if a company can sue a country for not bailing out a bank, for example, or something goes wrong within that country, is that any risky investment decisions, the liability is no longer within that corporation, but rather within the countries themselves. So essentially, this is just a transfer of risk, that the risk is being subsidized by this type of partnership per se. And another thing is, how will these courts even work in the first place? Like, how will this even work altogether?
I actually
how will the settlement fees work? How will this work? How will that work? Like, as in, how does the court case take place? And what guarantees is there that that state which lost the court case would actually pay for the apparent liable damages that they've incurred?
Yeah. I have a quote from that same article about how these courts are supposed to be set up. Let me just pull that up real quick. So the TPP and the other agreements being put forward provide for 3 judge courts to conduct the dispute settlement proceeding. One of the judges is actually selected by the corporate plaintiffs. All of the judges are private attorneys who in other disputes may have represented corporate plaintiffs. And it is common for attorneys to be shifting roles from corporate advocates in one case to judges in another. Of course, the advocates get paid far more than the judges. Can anyone imagine a more criminogenic environment than this, where all the incentives are aligned in such a way as to extract funds from state treasuries for the benefit of corporations and corporate attorneys alike?
Well, this provision is kind of crazy. It makes no sense at all. I mean, not just from an economic standpoint, but just altogether, like from a moral or political standpoint, it makes absolute no sense at all.
It's crony capitalism run
at its
amok.
best.
Yeah.
On a global scale as well.
Exactly.
Like beyond the reach of any government to curb or shut that down, or any people, let's say. Forget government.
But Well, what's next is that we should talk about how it's good that Trump actually opted out of TPP altogether. But of course, it's a good thing that Trump had actually opted out from TPP altogether. But the issue is, what's Trump going to do next for free trade? Is he going to do anything for free trade in the first place? So he's done one part right, but is he going to do the second part right altogether? And that's the big question.
Here's a thought on that. Trump. Okay, so one thing that I noticed when reading through a little bit on the TPP is that the TPP was going to take away over 18,000 trade restrictions and tariffs and barriers to trade. And I wonder if that's the main reason why Donald Trump wanted out of the TPP, with all his talk of tariffs and of, everything in the United States and restricting global influence there. I wonder if that's the driving factor.
Well, I certainly hope not. That's the actual driving factor. We don't know. We unfortunately don't have any access to ask Donald Trump directly. So we'll never know until he actually comes out and says why he disagreed with the TPP, truly.
Yeah. I think the overarching principle here is that Trump generally disagrees with multilateral trade agreements. He doesn't agree with NAFTA for the same reason. And WTO, I don't think he likes any of those multilateral agreements. Instead, he wants to have individual agreements from country to country.
What are your opinions on that? Is that how does that approach affect the country? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's hard to break it down to just good or bad, I'm sure, but
I think ultimately it comes down to transparency. How much transparency do we have in the process of crafting those agreements? And if Trump makes good on his promise, then it's all going to be about what's good for the American people. So I expect there to be a lot more transparency in the legislative process leading to those individual agreements. And then also I hope that they're easier to read and understand, obviously.
I agree. Even if it's a unilateral agreement between many countries or just individual agreements with many countries, there has to be a sense of transparency and an ease of actually reading these documents. And of course, they have to obviously promote free trade, or else the entire point of a trade agreement altogether, or at least a good trade agreement per se.
That makes sense. But back to your question there, Baland, what was the what are we kind of looking for? What do you think Trump will be instituting in place of this trade agreement? Is that kind of what Nima was saying, where it's more of a smaller scale trade agreements, more individually with different countries, as opposed to these broad unilateral agreements?
Well, see, the biggest problem is I think it would be small trade agreements, but at the same time, Trump is going to be pissing off a lot of different countries at the same time with the types of tariffs and other regulations which are going to be put in place with foreign goods. So, of course, the first thing you want to do is obviously take away any of these regulations and barriers. Now, the TPP does take away some of these barriers, 18,000, as you said, but it does add a lot more regulations and barriers. So it's kind of a net bad effect altogether. But the first step is obviously taking away these regulations and barriers, which prevent actual free trade. The next thing is to actually promote free trade. So saying that you want to put a tariff on Chinese goods is not the way to go in order to actually start a good relationship and actual individual trading contracts. Actually, Benjamin Powell came out with an article recently with FEE, and he said, of course, this is true, is that trade does not actually affect employment altogether. It just changes the mixture of employment within a country. So if a foreign country is producing much cheaper goods now, manufacturing cheaper goods, and it's being imported into one country, this therefore means the amount of goods, the same type of goods being manufactured in the domestic country will decrease and employment will just shift towards another sector. Rather than it actually destroying jobs, it just changes the shift of jobs towards what the country should actually be specialized in altogether, which is of course which is of course what's reflecting an actual efficient and dynamic market, international market per se. Oh, and as well as that, if we allow free trade, foreign countries will hold more dollars because they need to purchase, or sorry, when we purchase their goods, we send US dollars to yen, so therefore their accounts will increase in US dollars. I believe. Is that correct, Nima?
Well, that's what's been happening for the past 30 years or so, or 20 or 30 years after NAFTA is signed. The US trade deficit, and with that, the current account balance deficit has grown quite a bit. So that's already happening, right? A lot of foreigners are holding dollars because Americans are buying, and people abroad just want to hold the dollars. The Chinese are amassing foreign currency reserves. Many other countries are, because the dollar is in effect the world's reserve currency. So that's already been going on. And Trump has always portrayed that as a negative thing. If you've seen him talk about the trade deficit in his speeches, he always talks about so and so many $1 billion trade deficit as if that was in and of itself a bad thing, when in reality, in the net effect actually of more goods coming into the country than leaving the country is actually a positive effect. But question is, what other effects are there on employment and things like that? I asked Randall Ray what he thinks, whether pulling out of TPP or in fact making any changes to trade deals will have any impact on that trend of the ballooning capital account deficit. And he said that trade deals have virtually nothing to do with the development of the trade deficit. It's rather an expression of how much dollars foreigners want to hold, given that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. And when I asked him, so what could a politician do if he wanted to change the US trade balance or reduce the trade deficit? And then he said, rig the German election so that a Keynesian wins.
Well, basically, not only that, while foreigners hold more US dollars, this gives more of an opportunity for foreign direct investments to be placed within one country. If your trade deficits are increasing, your current account is increasing, your actual capital accounts or the movement of capital funds will start increasing at the same time. So you have actually more capital investments within a country as well. In fact, if you look, I remember reading an article on this. If you actually look at the actual data, there's been more capital balance as a not deficit. It's a surplus of capital funds being moved into the United States rather than decreasing as a deficit compared to the current account altogether.
So for people who aren't so clued into what capital accounts might be, what the trade deficit might be, and this is one reason why I wonder if Trump's rhetoric on the negative, or on making trade deficits seem like a negative, worked so well. Because for a lot of people, when we hear deficit, we think bad.
Yeah,
it's not a good thing. Deficit's bad. If we have a deficit, we got a problem. So having a trade deficit is not actually a bad thing in that case, as in it allows the US dollar to be the world currency or the world reserve currency, which means that the US is kind of the center of world trade in one way or another.
It's more the other way around. The US dollar is the world currency, and as a symptom of that, we have a lot of foreigners who want to hold dollars or treasury bonds. So that's sort of results in this trade deficit, according to a lot of economists, at least. Because you can obviously, if the US buys products from abroad and then foreigners have dollars, and then they use those dollars to invest in houses in the US or to buy products from the US, then there's a counterbalancing stream of dollars coming into the country. However, that's not the case as far as the current account deficit. There's a net outflow of dollars out of the United States at the moment, and over the past 20, 30 years. There's more dollars ending up in foreign bank accounts or being converted into treasury bills on the behalf of foreigners than dollars are coming, or foreign money is coming into the country. And Baland, you talked about investment and the capital account balance. So, for example, a foreigner holding a treasury bond counts as foreign investment. So that's why, there are some other trade balance, other types of trade balance that people look at that they then say counterbalances. But the net effect is that dollars are being held by foreigners because they want to hold dollars or dollar equivalent assets such as treasury bills and treasury bonds.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what is the effect that has on Americans?
They can buy more products more cheaply, ultimately. I mean, the net effect is that you have more goods coming in than goods going out. So just from that standpoint, from a real goods perspective, it's a net positive for U.S. consumers, at least.
And exactly. Sorry, my bad.
No, go ahead, Bung.
Exactly. It's a positive thing. Despite that we have less goods going out and more goods coming in, it allows our economy to actually start diversifying and specialize in other things which other economies would not have. So it opens actual opportunity investments towards other sectors, which, of course, if another country is focusing on exporting more goods in a cheaper price compared to what we're doing, we may be specializing in technology, for example, in the research of super high-speed internet, let's just say. While, for example, China is making mobile phones, let's just say, for that example. And effectively, the biggest problem with the United States is that it's not the actual trade balance which is causing the issues of unemployment and all these other issues between different different types of industries. It's that there's so much excess regulations. Sorry, someone's having feedback at the moment.
Yeah,
I hear.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I heard some feedback.
There we go.
Oh yeah. So basically, the biggest problem is that there's so much excess regulation between many different types of industries, even new industries coming up, and that you have so many different barriers, which makes the movement of labor and the hiring of labor a lot harder than what it should be. And you have so many business blockage, which stops actual entrepreneurship, which can capitalize on these opportunities which can arise from a trade deficit altogether, and furthermore increase the actual real wealth within a country. So effectively, we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot by continuing to try and decrease our trade deficit rather than focus on the real problem, which is excess regulations, excess amount of taxes, et cetera, which stops actual entrepreneurship and makes things harder altogether to actually conduct business domestically.
Yeah, there may be other reasons that are undesirable that ultimately lead to a trade deficit, but the trade deficit is always just a symptom, is the point ultimately.
That makes sense. So it's not really something that we should be looking at as a negative or as this is something we really need to change.
I don't think so. I think it's possible that it's going to change at one point. We don't know when, but it's very well possible that China changes its policy or European governments change their policy and ultimately start investing or start buying goods from the US more, and then we'll have a trade balance. Maybe the dollar will not always remain the reserve currency of the world. Maybe the Chinese yuan will one day be the reserve currency. Their economy is certainly big enough, but they're not floating it freely yet. So there's no chance of that happening anytime soon, but at one point, it's very well possible.
I argue that our trade deficit could change ultimately if we actually allow for entrepreneurship, the actual essence of entrepreneurship, to spring up domestically and take these opportunities, because then we're going to be creating goods which are not created in other industries in foreign markets, and therefore we'll actually start exporting goods which have not been made previously altogether. And this can ultimately reverse our trade deficit altogether. And like Nima said, trade deficit is only a symptom. It's an indicator of where goods are flowing. It doesn't mean it's a good or bad thing. So for example, if we have a trade deficit now, we may have a trade surplus in the future, because if we actually did have that sense of entrepreneurship and actual business culture within the domestic markets, we can be inventing or rearranging resources to come up with new products altogether. And thus, these new products can flow out of the United States and increase our trade surplus. The trade surplus is only an indicator. Trade surplus or deficit only indicates where the goods are coming from, but doesn't actually indicate actual economic situations right now, as in if it's a good or bad situation per se.
I see. I wanted to ask a question, and that makes a lot of sense. But I wanted to ask a question a little bit going back to what we were talking about the world reserve currency being U.S. dollars and the potential for that to change. I'm under the impression that having the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency allows the United States certain flexibility and certain freedoms that other countries don't necessarily enjoy, in that the chance of the U.S. dollar completely, like, for example, if you take the economic situation we had back in 2008, the chance of the U.S. dollar completely flatlining was almost zero, because in the end the world is so heavily invested in U.S. dollars, they just can't. No one can allow that to really fall. So one way or another, it's going to get propped back up. I could be completely wrong on this, but I just wanted to ask your opinions on this. Does having the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency allow the U.S. to maybe take on more debt, or allow the U.S. to do a few things that other countries would not be able to get away with?
Yeah, I would say that the U.S. is in a very favorable position because its own currency is the world's reserve currency, and the treasury bills that people buy with them are issued by the U.S. So I recently read an article, and I'll link that later, by forgot his name, but he wrote about how the U.S. trade, the world treasury bill and U.S. dollar standard allows the U.S. to embark on policies that don't really affect its citizens in the form of tax increases or inflation. For example, fight a lot foreign wars, and go in debt, and then have foreigners hold the treasury bills and the dollars that the U.S. government creates. So it's certainly possible that the U.S. can get away with a lot more foreign adventures under this global dollar reserve currency standard.
I'd say that the US dollar being the world reserve currency definitely adds flexibility towards what the US can do domestically and abroad per se. So if our national debt increases a lot, this still won't cut the confidence in the US dollar so badly altogether. It may decrease the confidence in the US dollar, but not as bad as if a country such as, let's see, any country that takes up a huge amount of debt with its own national currency, and that debt can't really be repaid per se. And if it's not the world reserve currency, or if it's not a major player in currency, then that country has a very big problem with confidence per se, if it can't be paid back. Compared to the US dollar, the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, of course, as we know. So effectively, the US has a lot of flexibility and room to continuously increase their debt, or continuously actually doing foreign intervention in, for example, whatever seems like a great idea, but of course we disagree with it in many cases. But essentially, it gives them that sort of flexibility. It still keeps the confidence high in the US dollar. And I believe if it continues this way and the Chinese don't float the yuan, there could be a possibility where the US dollar becomes, well, it is already now, but it even strengthens it even more, that the US dollar is too big to fail altogether.
Could it be argued that we're there already? Well, like you said, we're already there. It's just a matter of, is the yuan going to challenge? Am I right in saying that?
I think if decide to float it freely one day, it's a possibility.
Okay.
If they don't, it's impossible. It can't be the world reserve currency if they fix it on the foreign exchange market.
I'd like to make an argument which Nima would like. He would agree to this. The potential increases of things such as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies may become somewhat of the world reserve currency in some ways. There's a potential for that. So, of course, although the US dollar is the world reserve currency, because Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are so decentralized altogether, and that they don't have any political influences behind them, and that it's very easy to actually obtain them and freely move them around, because it's very hard to control Bitcoin in transactions, even if you send it to the black market. There's a potential that Bitcoin could become ultimately a world reserve currency, or, well, it's not really a currency as we know, but just in the figurative sense, it's a currency. We'll just name it as a currency. It'll become the actual world reserve currency, and this could topple the US dollar, which will have a lot of unintended consequences altogether.
Do you agree with that? Is that...
I think, yeah, I mean, it used to be gold, and you could argue it's still is gold, which is sort of the ultimate settlement layer in international global finance, if all else fails. Like if your entire country's currency fails, then you as the government, you still have some gold in your treasury so you can bail and maintain your standard of living. So that could become Bitcoin one day. I don't see why not, because Bitcoin is much easier to transfer and to use and to actually send large sums around the world or even the universe without a lot of logistical efforts involved.
Interesting.
Indeed, definitely. I agree with that.
Well, guys, sorry, just real quick. We're running a little short on time. Go ahead, Baland, and then I have one question to ask, and we'll try and wrap it up from there.
Yes. So basically, there's a possibility that Bitcoin would become the world reserve currency altogether, and then if that happens, the U.S. will be, I wouldn't say in the greatest position possible. That's an understatement. It'll be in a very, very, very bad position, terrible position. I don't know if Nima and you would agree with that, but that's how I see it at the moment. There could be a possibility that could happen altogether.
They're quite leveraged into that. Like that is kind of the stopgap to a lot of economic problems then.
Yeah, I mean, if the Bitcoin becomes the world, something like world reserve currency, then governments will probably start buying up a lot of Bitcoins sooner or later. And then I guess it depends on who has how many Bitcoins to make the determination who's got the strongest backing, I guess. But
invest. I'm investing now on Bitcoins. That's it. I've determined this.
And when the change comes, just buy the United States.
I've always told people it's not a bad idea to look into it.
To be fair, I'm not a great investor altogether. I don't know much about investing. I'm more on the sense of investments in towards actual physical businesses rather than commodities and stocks altogether.
Yeah.
Like starting a business or funding a venture. But
I actually recently shared an article called The Investing Myth, where Colin Roche talks about how the word investing is actually oftentimes misused because what you talked about, investing, entrepreneurship, that is real investment, to buy a machinery that makes your business better. But to buy a stock is actually just shifting around savings. It's not really investment. To buy Bitcoins, it's just shifting around your savings. It's not really an investment.
I'd agree with that.
Interesting.
Actually, I'd agree with that. That's a good statement.
Yeah.
So your question.
So yeah, I wanted to circle us back to the TPP real quick as we end here, and no, just ask. So, from your viewpoints, from a libertarian perspective, an aspect of freedom, liberty, and individual autonomy, I guess, and also from what we understand of the TPP right now, would you say that more or less it was a good thing that Donald Trump pulled out of it, and that that leaves that door open for new trade agreements? Or would you say that that maybe some changes should have been made, but we should have stayed in that agreement altogether.
Nima, do you want to start?
Okay, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I'd say it was a good thing to pull out, but ultimately it's too early to decide if this was a good thing. I mean, technically speaking, the outcomes could be a good thing or just a continuous bad outcome altogether, depending on what Trump does. If Trump decides to take this protectionist point of view and this protectionist policy, then essentially nothing has really changed altogether. We're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot again altogether, rather than actually finding a good solution to alleviate what the TPP's damage could have done altogether. But essentially, I'd say it's too early to judge, depending on what Trump does. If he goes towards a more free trade proposal, which is highly unlikely by what he's been campaigning and proposing altogether, then that's a benefit. It's a complete benefit towards the United States. But if he decides to go with the protectionist type of view, then, well, we're kind of back in square one all again.
Yeah, I think from a libertarian perspective, I don't obviously like big government. I don't like big government legislation. And if it's legislation that is crafted by multiple big governments around the world in cahoots with crony capitalist corporations, then I don't really understand why libertarians could possibly consider the TPP something favorable. So I would say it just the net effect of just finally delivering a death blow to the TPP versus not doing that, I think certainly what has happened is preferable from a libertarian perspective.
Awesome. Yeah. You know what? Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your input. I appreciate the topics that were raised. Very interesting. And I have probably 100,000 more questions on the reserve currencies and the effects and all that. But that's something I should probably read as well.
You see, most of those questions, such as more of a macro perspective, although I have a good background of macro, Nima has most probably the best background in macro in the whole entire group. So basically refer your questions to Nima and not me. That's what I'm saying. So put the pressure off me as much as possible.
Fair enough. Well, thanks, guys. Again, I appreciate it. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Talk
bye.
to you soon as well. See you.